Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be breaking down the Wednesday, January 10th slate of college basketball DFS. We had a big-time slate on Tuesday. It was a 12-gamer. DraftKings brought out all the big dollar contests, and Wednesday is not as good as Tuesday, but there's still some, pretty good contests that are being offered on DraftKings as well as FanDuel. And it's only a 9-game slate, so it's a little bit less options, a little bit less to break down, a little bit less overwhelming, or I guess more whelming would be the right way to word that. But either way, we're here to break down all 9 games for you here on today's episode and let you know who needs to be in or out of your DFS lineups on DraftKings and FanDuel. Now, I do want to address one thing. If you were looking for, a Tuesday episode from us, we did the golf preview last night. Last night was also the national championship game for college football, so I was watching that. So we just didn't have time to, record and upload another episode for the Tuesday college basketball slate. So if there's ever a slate where you're looking for an episode that I, do not have, I highly advise you to join the Fantasy Corner Discord. Link is in the description below. Because we were in there talking all day about the best plays, strategy. I had notes for all 12 of the games on kind of where I was looking at for all of them. And some of the plays from those notes ended up being pretty good. So if there's ever a slate that I miss, Fantasy Corner Discord is the place to go if you want to get some of my help, or if you just want to be a part of a fun community that is growing and is, getting pretty sharp when it comes to college basketball DFS. So that does it for the introduction. Let's go ahead and dive in now to game 1 of this 9-game slate. So we've got a 9-game slate tonight, and this is a little bit different in terms of what we normally see from a college basketball slate. There are not a whole lot of games that really stand out in terms of like super high totals, or even games that stand out in terms of super low totals. This is a slate where you are going to want to get injury news, but the good news is the games with all of the injury news are kind of earlier in the slate, which is going to help us out quite a bit. More on that a little bit later. Well, let's go ahead and start talking about game 1 of the night, the battle in the Big East between Providence and St. John's, which are two teams that I have personally enjoyed watching play so far this season. They've got some really fun guys that are really fun to watch, and a lot of guys that have helped make me some money so far this season in DFS. So the projected total in this one, according to KenPom, is 74-70 in favor of St. John's. What KenPom really hasn't factored in, though, is that Providence is playing without Bryce Hopkins. He is probably their best all-around player, either him or Devin Carter, and he tore his ACL against Seton Hall and will not be back for the rest of the season. So you got to feel like you got to give St. John's a little bit of a bump because of that. However, this is a pretty good game environment. Both of these teams are top 150 in tempo. So even for the Providence side, even if you don't think they get to that projected total of 70, you got to think with the pace up spot that they're going to be getting going against St. John's, there's going to be a lot of possessions. There's going to be a lot of opportunities for fantasy points. And on the Providence side, they played a super short rotation with that injury to Bryce Hopkins. And so it's kind of condensed everything a little bit and definitely giving a lot more opportunities for fantasy scoring from the guys that they are playing. Both Devin Carter and Josh Aduru had over a 30% usage rate last game. Carter went for 46 fantasy points against Creighton, and Aduru only went for 16, but he did get up 17 shots. And that was a game that was pretty slow tempo against Creighton. Providence only scored 60 points. So those two definitely have no complaints about. Like, you're going to see a ton of usage and a ton of shots from both Carter and Aduru. The other 3 guys that played all the minutes were Ticket Gaines, Jaden Pierre, and Corey Floyd Jr. What's interesting enough, though, is that all 3 of them played over 29 minutes, but none of them really had like a super successful fantasy day. Ticket Gaines gave you 23 fantasy points against Creighton. Jaden Pierre gave you 28.5. He was the best of the bunch, especially considering he was a little bit lower in salary. And then Corey Floyd Jr., played 29 minutes, did not make a field goal, only gave you 5.5 fantasy points. I don't mind going with any of the 3 of those guys. Those are the 5 I'm probably sticking with for Providence. And I think that especially if you're stacking this game up, at least it's pretty clear who your stacking options are. I'll be honest, I'm kind of not opposed to going back to Corey Floyd, even though he had a dud last game, just because he's going to play 30 minutes in this game and he's only $3,900. Now, on the St. John's side, you got to monitor the injury to Chris Ledlam. So Chris Ledlam has missed 2 of the last 3 games for St. John's. He is a very productive player. When he's active, he is second in usage. What is really relevant is that in their last game, Brady Dunlap was moved to the starting lineup and started at the 4, and he played really well. He put up 18 fantasy points, 5 for 8 from the field on 31 minutes. He didn't really do a whole lot outside of scoring. I would have liked to see a little bit more peripheral stats from him, but if he's going to get the start because Ledlam is out, he's definitely a guy that can be in your lineups at $4,000. Now, what you've also seen in the 2 games that Chris Ledlam has missed is they have been absolute smash spots for Dennis Jenkins. He scored 36.75 when Ledlam missed against Villanova and 44.25 when Ledlam missed against Hofstra. I think it's because of the peripheral stats. Dennis Jenkins has put up a lot of rebounds and assists in Chris Ledlam's absence because Chris Ledlam is a guy that does have pretty high rebounding rates. RJ Luis is also a guy with some upside as well. He's a little bit expensive now, and he did play reduced minutes last game with Brady Dunlap moving into the starting lineup, but he only needed 19 minutes to get to 23 fantasy points against Villanova. If you were ever to see 30 minutes, like he did against Hofstra, he could very easily get to 30 fantasy points. I just wish that the minutes were there for him at that high price tag of $6,100, or if the price tag were about $5,100, I'd feel a lot more comfortable playing him. Now, on to game number 2, which is Northwestern at Penn State. This one is projected to be Northwestern 73-71 according to KenPom. According to KenPom, also Penn State ranks 53rd in tempo and Northwestern ranks 345th. However, one thing that you will notice though when you look at the game logs for these Northwestern guys, they have gotten in some shootouts this year. They have gotten in some high-scoring games. They tend to play to the pace of their opponent, and they've just played a lot of opponents who play with a slow tempo, such as Dayton, such as Rhode Island, such as Western Michigan, such as DePaul. So, when they play a team that gets a faster tempo, they get up and down, and they're going to put up some points. And so I really do like this Northwest side in this game. They've also kind of changed up the rotation a little bit in conference play. Boo Buie has really been their guy in conference play. One thing that I've kind of hammered home on a lot of the episodes so far is once these teams get into conference play, this is pretty much a must-win situation every night for these teams. The rotations are going to get shorter. They're going to play their guys, their best guys, as many minutes as they can. And you're going to see the usage concentrate around the best players as well. So for Northwestern, what you've seen is in both conference games, Boo Buie's had over a 28% usage rate. And he's been especially good in pace-up games so far this season, including that 45 fantasy point performance against Michigan State last Sunday. He's a guy that is definitely probably one of my favorite high-priced guards on this slate. There's a few other guys that are going to be contingent on injuries, but he is probably one of the top guards on this slate, in my opinion. You have also seen Ty Berry have increased usage in conference play. In fact, he has been over 31 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games. And he's a guy that I think you got to consider at a salary of only $6,700. The shots are there. The usage is there. He's not just reliant on scoring, and he's got a pace-up game against Penn State. I think this is a really good spot for Ty Berry as well. Another thing that's interesting for Northwestern is they did move Luke Hunger into the starting lineup 2 games ago, the game against Illinois. He's only played 19 minutes in both games, but his 2 fantasy point totals have been 15 and 20.5. And I got to be honest, at a guy that's only $4,000, that's not a bad outcome. So Luke Hunger is a guy that I'm definitely considering as a value play at the forward spot for my lineups. On the Penn State side, I will be, until something changes, Team Clary over Team Baldwin. And I'm referring to Kanye, Clary, and Ace Baldwin Jr. These are Penn State's 2 lead guards. They're both very good at basketball. They're very good players. Baldwin put up a 40 spot last game against Michigan, but I am still Clary over Baldwin because even in games where Clary doesn't shoot well, like the Michigan game, Baldwin was 8 for 13. Clary was 5 for 20. Even in the games where Clary doesn't shoot well, he takes more shots than Ace Baldwin. And they're both about the same when it comes to the peripheral stats. So I think that just the higher number of shots gives Clary a higher ceiling. And if he does happen to, shoot the ball well, which, he did against Ryder a few games ago, he put up 37 fantasy points in that game. So I really do think that Clary is the option I would prefer over Ace Baldwin just because of the amount of opportunities that he is going to see in the game. Now, because of the pace down spot against Northwestern, I'm not super interested in really any of these other Penn State guys. You've got DeMarco Dunn, who has a high usage rate but doesn't really play a whole lot of minutes, who could be a solid value. His price tag's a little high in my opinion. Puff Johnson and Nick Kern have both had decent games, but they're at a salary that's a little bit above their head in my opinion, and so I'm passing on the Penn State guys in a pace down matchup. Now, let's go ahead and move on to Tennessee at Mississippi State. KenPom has this one projected to be 71-68 in favor of KenPom. This is the lowest combined total on the slate. So this could be one where, in only a 9-game slate, this is one that you could cross off entirely. What's surprising is that both these teams currently rank above average in tempo. I was not expecting to see that when I looked it up. You think of Rick Barnes and Chris Jans coach teams as just being these slow, methodical, defensive-minded teams. Well, they have played played faster this season, but they're still elite defensively. Both of these teams are top 10 in the nation in defensive efficiency, according to Ken Palm. So I just don't expect there to be a whole lot of points scored in this game. So I think that there is just not really a whole lot to like about it. One thing that you do have to monitor for Tennessee going forward, though, is Zakai Ziegler is all the way back. He had a season-ending injury last year, and they kind of eased him into the season this year. Well, in his last 2 games, he's played 27 and 37 minutes, and he has put up 33 and 44 fantasy points in both those games. He's now up to $7,700 on DraftKings when he was about $4,000, around the time of the Maui Invitational. So definitely a guy that I think you got to consider just because of how much he can, fill up the stat sheet. But I like Zakai Ziegler in pace-up games against poor defensive teams, and this is not one of those. So there's definitely pros and cons to Zakai Ziegler. Also on the Tennessee side, Triple J, Josiah Jordan-James, has also been pretty solid lately. He's put up 27 or more fantasy points in 4 straight games. That's 4 times value for his salary. And you're kind of seeing, as conference play has gone on, the usage increase for those 2 guys to kind of where it was last year. Dalton Knecht was Tennessee's guy at the start of the season, but he has not been great recently. But I think he could be a really interesting low-owned pivot play on DraftKings in GPPs, because I don't think a whole lot of people are going to rush to play him. And at a salary of only $5,300, this is a guy who has put up, multiple games of 30 and one game over 50 earlier this season. So I definitely could see, there being a big-time Dalton Knecht game at some point this season. I don't think it's necessarily likely to happen against Mississippi State, though. Now, on the Mississippi State side, one more guy for Tennessee, Jonas Adu. He is their starting center. He's been great recently as well. But tough matchup against Mississippi State, so it's probably a pass for me. Now, on the Mississippi State side, why is it a tough matchup? Well, they have Toulouse Smith back in the lineup. He was their best player on their team that went to the NCAA tournament last season. He was recovering from an injury. He's played 2 games now. He played 19 and 20 minutes in those 2 games. He still came off the bench against South Carolina. I think that they're probably going to play him more minutes this game. And he's a guy that when he's on the floor, they're going to play through him. He is going to have the rock in his hands in the post. And then on defense, he's going to be at the rim protecting it, getting blocks and getting rebounds. So I kind of think with this Mississippi State team, none of these guys are priced for Toulouse Smith to be in the lineup. So I kind of don't really have a whole lot of interest in any of them, just because I know when Toulouse Smith does play more minutes, he's going to steal a lot of those boards, and he's going to take a lot of possessions away offensively from some of these guys, because he's going to be the one having the ball and not them. So I'm really not interested in a whole lot of these Mississippi State guys because of that fact. Now, if you want to play Toulouse Smith because you think that he plays 30 minutes and has a pretty good game, I think that's a viable strategy, but I'm probably staying away from the other Mississippi State guys. All right, next up on the list is Kansas heading to Orlando to take on UCF. KenPom has this one projected to be Kansas 75-68. This is a pace-up spot for Kansas because UCF plays at the 59th ranked tempo in the nation. To me, this feels like a big Hunter Dickinson game. I just kind of get that vibe. UCF is not super big down low. They're not they play a lot of guys in the center position, but none of them are really like stars. None of them are really like elite defensively either. And against this same UCF team, Norchad Omier had 19 and 10 against them. I definitely think that Hunter Dickinson could be a guy that could go off against them. However, you've also seen some elite guards go off against this UCF team. Pretty much stars have had good games against UCF to this point in the season. So that would bode well for Kevin McCullough, who is a guy that we've talked about at length this season as just being a guy who has always done well in the peripheral stats. Right now, he's averaging almost 7 boards and 4.5 assists per game. And now he's finally scoring. Now he's averaging 20 points per game this season. So Kevin McCullough Jr. and Hunter Dickinson, I think they're both in play. And I got to be honest, I very rarely see people do this, but I think that you can stack both of them together, because I think that there's just a chance that the two of them combine for 80 plus fantasy points. And, it doesn't matter how it comes. If they get to, 85 fantasy points total, that's easily hitting 4 times value for you. And in fact, they've gone over a combined 80 fantasy points in 3 of their last 6 games. And this is a better matchup against UCF. So I really do think that that could be a viable strategy here on this Wednesday night slate. I'm not really interested on anybody else on Kansas just because Dickinson and McCullough eat up so much of the usage. KJ Adams tends to be better against teams that play small ball, and I don't necessarily think that UCF fits that description. DeJuan Harris rarely ever shoots, so it's a hard sell on that one, in my opinion. Elmarco Jackson is out there, so if you're looking to stack a Kansas lineup, you're getting a guy that's playing a lot of minutes, even though he might not take a whole lot of shots, and that's pretty much it for the Kansas side. For UCF, Jalen Sellers and Darius Johnson both play at over a 24% usage rate, and both have had some big-time games so far this season. And I kind of think that, if you think that UCF keeps this game close, or if you want UCF to keep this game close, then these are the two guys that I would consider, because their rotation at the forward position is a mess. Like I said earlier, they play like 4 different guys, and none of them play big-time minutes. None of them are exceptionally high usage players. So Sellers and Johnson would be kind of where I would make my hay at with this UCF lineup. Now, last one before we take a little bit of a breather, let's talk about Louisville heading to Coral Gables to take on Miami. So this is the game with the injury news that you're going to have to monitor. So KenPom has this one projected to be Miami 88-71, which gives Miami the highest team total on the slate by a wide margin, and it actually makes this game the highest scoring game total on the slate. However, KenPom doesn't know that Miami has all these injury issues. So let's go ahead and talk about Louisville first. So Trey White is questionable for Louisville. He is their second highest usage player. I don't necessarily know if he plays or not, but if he doesn't, what you saw in their last game where he did not play was Tyler Johnson moved into the starting lineup. And you saw usage lump around Mike James, Sky Clark, and Tyler Johnson. So those would be the guys that I would be considering if Trey White is out. Mike James in particular had a great game against Pitt. He had 38.5 fantasy points on 8 for 12 shooting, played 37 minutes. He was pretty much indispensable for that Louisville team. So he would be a guy that I think you would definitely have to consider if Trey White was out. You also saw a 4x value game from Curtis Williams. He was I believe $3,600 was his most recent price on DraftKings, put up 17 fantasy points in that game that Trey White missed. So he's got to be considered as well. And then Brendan Huntley Hatfield is a guy that I'm going to talk about. He's got to be considered, in my opinion, also. He's been kind of terrible lately, but he has had upside. He had 3 games in a row earlier in the season of over 32 fantasy points. And Miami is a team that is very vulnerable to big men. We saw it on Saturday with both Austin Carr and Efton Reed of Wake Forest having big games. We've seen it time and time again this season and last season, where Norchad Omier, as good as he is, his height and his inability to foul kind of, renders his defense a little bit less physical than it could be. And so Brendan Huntley Hatfield could be the beneficiary of that at only $6,600. I think he's a very valid sleeper play. Now, on the Miami side, here's where we got to talk about all the injuries. 3 of their starting 5 are currently questionable for this game, and they are one of the most starting 5 heavy teams in the nation. They play a very small, short bench. So here's what we got to do with all the if-thens, right? So Norchad Omier, their starting center, Wooga Poplar, their starting small forward, and Nigel Pack, their starting point guard, are all listed as questionable for this game. So you ready for the flow chart? So if Wooga Poplar misses, that's the easy one because he has already missed 2 games. If he misses, Keyshawn George will start in his place, and Keyshawn George has been pretty doggone good starting in his place. Last 3 games, 30, 27, and 35 fantasy points. If Nigel Pack misses, then what you will have happen is Wooga Poplar and Bensley Joseph would see increased usage. Keyshawn George would be in the starting lineup. That would be their starting backcourt, would be Poplar, Joseph, and George. Now, if both Poplar and Pack miss, Keyshawn George would still start. Bensley Joseph would see a huge bump in usage rate, and the other starter would be Christian Watson, who had a pretty big night a few games ago when Miami was missing some players also, put up 26 fantasy points against North Florida. Now, the other one is the big question mark, Norchad Omier, the big fella. If he misses, AJ Casey figures to be the starter. However, it wouldn't shock me if it was Michael Nwoko either. Both of them have been playing minutes as the backup center. Casey has been playing more of them. And for a team that is very starting 5 heavy, if they don't have that starting 5, then the new starting 5 is going to have to be very heavy in the minutes. And so I think that if all 3 or 2 of these guys are listed as out, then Casey and Watson become some of the best value plays on the slate. And the starters that are not questionable for injury, Matthew Cleveland and Bensley Joseph, should get a huge bump as well. I think you can play 3 or 4 Miami Hurricanes in your lineups tomorrow if we do get the injury news and we know who is in fact out for this team. All right, that does it for the first segment. So let's go ahead and take a quick breather, and then let's break down the last 4 games. All right, so before we get to these last four games, I do want to mention there are a few places where you can get more information from me. First off, you can find me on Twitter, otherwise known as X, at Mike's Money Picks. I do my best to tweet out the DFS rundown for every college basketball slate, where I just kind of highlight all of my favorite categorical plays of the slate, as well as any updates for the show. I do try to get them out there as well. So follow me on there. I'm also more than happy to answer any start, sit, or lineup questions that you have for me. You can also join the Fantasy Corner Discord. The link is in the description. We got a lot of smart people in there who play DFS for a lot of different sports, and it's entirely free. I'm talking college basketball, NBA, golf, NFL, whatever your sport is. We've got it covered in the Fantasy Corner Discord, and it's a great place to just join and bounce ideas off other people, talk lineups, talk strategy. It's a lot of fun. I really enjoy being in there, and part of the fun of it is just kind of sweating it out together and just kind of having fun and building that community. So I highly recommend it if you're looking for people to talk DFS with. You can also read the articles that I post to my Patreon every single day for college basketball, where I highlight all of my core plays as well as kind of my lineup strategy and attack strategy for the slate. There's not a whole lot of people out there doing stuff like this, so I do think that you can get a lot of good information, a lot of good building blocks for building your own strategy, building your own lineups. I'm not going to sit here and guarantee that you can just plug in the guys that I have and just instantly win GPPs. It's not that easy, but I do think you can get a lot of strategy, a lot of advice, and I do think that it can help you become a better DFS college basketball player. Lastly, if you're looking to try something new this college basketball season, I know some places changed some laws up January 1. Head on over to signupexpert.com/Mike's Picks. We're partnering with Sign Up Expert, and what they do is they get you the best offers and promo codes for new users on any DFS player prop or sportsbook site, and it'll even sync to your location to only show you what's legal in your state or province. That's for my Canadian folks. And so, basically, if you want to try Underdog, it's on there. Get yourself your first deposit match. If you want to try a new sportsbook like Caesars or FanDuel or whatever, head on over to signupexpert.com/Mike's Picks. Get yourself that offer and promo code, and it also shows me some support as well by using my links. All right, so let's go ahead and close this on up by talking about the last four games. Next up on the docket is Clemson taking on Virginia Tech. This one, Ken Palm has projected to be Clemson 73-72. Close game and a decent total. But what's weird is that Virginia Tech this season, to me, has kind of just been out-athleted in the ACC. Like, they're just not a very athletic, mobile team, and they can get beat off the dribble. They can get beat vertically. I don't necessarily think Clemson is going to challenge that, though. So I think it's an intriguing matchup from that standpoint, where Clemson can't really take advantage of one of Virginia Tech's biggest weaknesses. Now, for Clemson, PJ Hall has been their guy all season long, but he has been kind of dreadful in these two conference games, putting up 23 and 21 fantasy points in his last two. However, it's worth mentioning that he fouled out of both of those games. Foul trouble has been his undoing. If he can stay out of foul trouble, then he absolutely has 50 fantasy point upside. We've seen that from him this season, 2 games of 50 fantasy points or more. Very high usage rate, very high rebounding rates. But if he can't stay on the floor, you can't play him. And so I think what you're going to have to look at with Clemson for the rest of the season is, does the other team have a big that is high usage and draws a lot of fouls? In this case, Virginia Tech has Lynn Kidd, who doesn't have the highest usage rate, but is a guy that can get some offensive boards and can draw some fouls down there. So I'm very, very cautious about playing PJ Hall. I don't think there's a whole lot of safety there, but I do think he makes for an intriguing GPP play because a lot of people were burned by him and are not going to go back to him. So I think that he's going to be a low-owned GPP play, but if I'm being totally honest, there's other guys in his price range that I would rather play, and I'm going to talk more about them later. Now, for the rest of the Clemson guys, the guy that I like is Chase Hunter, their point guard. So he has really seen his shot attempts rise in recent games. Starting about 5 games ago, he hasn't attempted less than 8 shots in any of those 5 games, and he attempted 15 and 14 shots in 2 conference games where he played 36 minutes in both games. So you're looking at a guy who has a high assist rate and is taking a lot of shots. I kind of think there's some upside there for Chase Hunter, and I do think that he would be the guy who would be able to exploit Virginia Tech's weakness of, an athletic guard. I don't see that really happening with Joe Girard. It wouldn't shock me if Chase Hunter put up like 25 and 5 assists tomorrow night. Now, on the Virginia Tech side, we talked about Lynn Kidd, and, bigs have kind of done well against PJ Hall in conference play because they've been able to get him in foul trouble. And so if Lynn Kidd can do that, Lynn Kidd has upside. We've seen him have a 50 fantasy point game earlier this season. I don't mind him as a play at 7,600. Kind of the same preface with PJ Hall, though. There's bigs I would rather pay up for higher price than him than where he's at $7,600. Guy that I do like for Virginia Tech, though, is Sean Padua. So at the beginning of the season, Sean Padula was great. 41, 47 fantasy points in his first 2 games, had other games of 39 and 33, and he got banged up around like the Christmas break, like around the end of the semester for the college kids. And so Virginia Tech wasn't playing a lot of games, and he wasn't playing a lot in the games that he played in. At Wake Forest, he still didn't look entirely right. He only played 19 minutes. He put up 8 fantasy points. He was kind of dreadful. He had 6 turnovers. But he looked back against FSU. And in that game against FSU, he played 34 minutes. He had a 35% usage rate, and he put up 31 fantasy points. I think there's a lot of upside in Sean Padula, and a guy whose price tag wasn't adjusted after that 31 fantasy point game. So I think, Sean Padula makes for a really intriguing play, really high upside play at only $5,700 on DraftKings. And I think that you can play him unstacked, but if you wanted to stack him, I think it would be very easy to stack him with his big man Lynn Kidd, or, the designated shooter on the perimeter, Hunter Couture. I think that those two would make for decent stacking partners for the Hokies. And those would kind of be my primary interest for Virginia Tech, is playing Sean Padula either by himself or with Couture or with Lynn Kidd. But Padula is definitely my favorite individual play in this game in its entirety. Now, next up on the list is UNC taking on NC State. And if you don't live in North Carolina, I don't think you kind of understand just how big this rivalry is. Like, obviously, it is not Carolina Duke, but for NC State fans and NC State players, this is their Super Bowl. They want to beat Carolina more than anybody else in the world. And the games that are played in PNC Arena tend to get rocking, and NC State tends to play very well in them. That being said, Ken Pom has this game projected to be North Carolina 79-74. This is one of the best game environments of the slate because both these teams like to get up and down. For UNC, one of my favorite bigs on the entire slate is Armando Bacot. I kind of went over earlier, one of my favorite guards on the whole slate is Boo Buie. One of my favorite bigs on the whole slate is Armando Bacot. And the reason why is we've gone over all season long how DJ Burns, as much as I love him for NC State, he is not an elite defensive player. And the last time UNC played NC State last season, Armando Bacot went for 23 points and 18 rebounds. We know Armando Bacot has that upside, and he's only $8,400 on DraftKings. That is like the lowest I've seen him priced since pretty much college basketball DFS came back, because Armando Bacot's been in college ever since college basketball DFS came back. So, I definitely like the idea of playing Bacot against NC State in a matchup where we have seen him smash in the past. Now, RJ Davis has not been great lately, but it hasn't been because of a lack of usage. He has still gotten a lot of shot attempts, and he's still had a very high usage rate in his last 2 games. The problem has been the game environments. They've just been these slow, sloggy games that haven't had a lot of points scored. And so now you've got RJ Davis taking on an NC State team that likes to get up and down in a game environment where we're projected over 150 points, and he's probably going to play 35 plus minutes. I think this is a really good spot for RJ Davis as well. And I don't think that you have to go exclusively Davis or Bacot, kind of like a McCullough-Dickinson situation, except at a lesser cost. I think you can play RJ Davis and Armando Bacot and have them combine for about $17,000 in salary. And I think if you get 75 points out of them, you would be a very happy camper with that. And I think that's a very distinct possibility with these two guys because their usage is that high. Now, also, Harrison Ingram is worth talking about as well. He's had a lot of usage in recent games, but he's been very cold shooting the ball. His last 3 games have been 3 for 9, 2 for 14, and 3 for 10. If he actually starts making some shots, he's going to have some big-time fantasy performances. Cormac Ryan has been a consistent value for these Carolina Tar Heels. He's pretty much been between 18 and 28 fantasy points for about the last month now. And I just think that if you're looking to stack up this game, it's a great game environment. You want to get multiple pieces from Carolina. Maybe you want to pair him with RJ Davis and look to get those assists. I think he's a really solid option for that. I think he's a really solid cash game play as well because you know he's going to play a lot of minutes and you know he's going to get you at least 18 fantasy points. Now, what's also worth noting is that Seth Trimble is now playing more minutes per game than Elliott could do, but he's a little high priced in my opinion. I would rather see Seth Trimble at $4,000 or below if he's still only playing 21 minutes and not really having a super high usage rate. But I just think that is a trend worth noting. Now, on the NC State side, Their highest priced player is DJ Horn, and for good reason. He is their best player, and he has their highest usage rate right now. In 2 of his last 3 games, he's had 31 fantasy points and 46 fantasy points, and he has taken at least 12 shots at least 11 shots in 6 straight games. He will fill up the stat sheet with rebounds and assists as well. If you're going to be playing the Carolina guys and you think that this game really is going to shoot out, play DJ Horn on the other side. That is my advice. DJ Burns. Again, I love the guy. He's a very fun watch. He's a very unique college basketball player. I'm going to miss watching him. Like, there's very few college basketball players that don't play for one of my teams. And I say my teams because I am a University of Texas Longhorns fan since childhood. I attended the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. So Texas and Charlotte are kind of my 2 teams, as well as the University of Dayton being my dad's team. So those are the 3 teams that I follow. Outside of my 3 teams, there's very few guys that like I will sit down and say, I enjoy watching that guy play college basketball. DJ Burns is one of them. He's got a very unique game. But the problem is that he's not playing a whole lot of minutes right now. He's been 24 minutes or less in State's last 4 games, and he hasn't really gotten that big of foul trouble. It kind of concerns me. I think it definitely caps his upside if he's not going to be playing more than 25 to 30 minutes. Now, also with NC State, like DJ Horn, I think is the guy you would want. Jaden Taylor is at a very affordable price tag for a guy who is going to play a ton of minutes and is going to probably take double-digit shots. I don't think that's a very bad value play, and that would kind of be where my interest in the NC State guys would end. All right, 2 games left. Next up is going to be UConn taking on Xavier in the Big East. Ken Pom has this one projected UConn 75 to 71. On the UConn side, I am willing to buy the dip on Tristan Newton. So we know that the story with UConn is that Donovan Clingan is out for the next month, and Tristan Newton has continued to lead the team in usage with Donovan Clingan being out. The problem is he's just not shooting the ball very well, and he hasn't really put up a whole lot of peripheral stats either. But the usage rate is there. The potential for big fantasy points is there. There is going to be a big Tristan Newton game coming if this usage rate continues. It just hasn't happened yet. And so now he's at as cheap of a price tag as he's been all season long. Well, pretty much since the first week of the season. And I'm willing to buy that dip on him and hope that that usage rate will, kind of regress towards the mean and he'll have a big fantasy output. Now, one guy who has not had the biggest usage rate but has had elite fantasy performances is Stephon Castle. He's been over 32 fantasy points in each of his last 2 games. He's been hyper efficient from the field. He has at least 11 rebounds plus assists in each of the last 2 games. Like, he has a very narrow path to fantasy scoring if he's not going to be taking that many shots. But if he's going to continue to play that well, you got to consider him, especially at a salary of only $6,900. Now, Samson Johnson has been the fill-in for Donovan Clingan, and he's done admirably. Like, he's not bad. He's not quite the scoring player that Clingan is. He's not playing a super high minute total. He's just kind of been okay. I think you got to consider him for your lineups, especially in cash games. At only $5,100, I think there's a very high likelihood that he returns 4x value, especially against a weak Xavier defensive front court. But Alex Caravan, to me, is the main beneficiary of the Donovan Clingan injury. He's been playing more minutes at the 5 with Donovan Clingan being out. In his last 2 games, he's put up 33 and 30 fantasy points, and that's with him not really taking a whole lot of shots just yet. Kind of like Tristan Newton, I think there is a big game coming for Alex Caravan. I just don't know when it's going to happen. On the Xavier side, they center their usage around 3 players: Quincy Olivari, Desmond Claude, and Abu Usman. And I kind of think that I'm not really considering a whole lot of guys outside of those 3. Dalen Swain as a value play is not bad, but he doesn't really shoot the basketball a whole lot, which kind of inhibits his ability to score a lot of fantasy points. But he's only $3,800. There's worse value plays on the slate than him. But with so much usage going to Olivari, Claude, and Usman, I think a lot of the other peripheral Xavier players, it's just hard. Olivari has kind of showed to be a pretty good player for them recently. He's taken 13 and 20 shots in his last 2 games. If he's going to take that many shots against UConn, he might get value, but at $8,100, that's a tough ask. Desmond Claude puts up a lot of peripheral stats. He averages almost 5 boards and 4 assists per game. He's been kind of quiet recently, and he would be another guy that I would consider, but I'm not super high on. And then Abu Usman is their starting center. Doesn't play huge minute games. He tends to play well against like teams that are good matchups for bigs, like guys that we played bigs against all season. So I don't necessarily think this game against UConn is a great spot for him, but just wanted to mention those three guys. That is where Xavier's usage is centering around, and those are the guys that I think you have to consider if you are playing a lot of Xavier guys, which I think you can X them off the slate entirely, and I wouldn't have a problem with that. Now, let's go ahead. No pun intended when I said X them out the slate, by the way. Let's go ahead and take a look at the last game, Wisconsin taking on Ohio State. KenPom has this one projected to go in favor of the Badgers, 72-71. Now, Wisconsin has really centered their offense around A.J. Storr. He has a massive usage rate recently. The problem is, though, with A.J. Storr, and I've said this all season long, he doesn't do a whole lot else outside of scoring. And so the path to his fantasy ceiling is with him dropping 29 points like he did against Chicago State, or against him just having a really, what's the word I'm looking for? Outlier night in terms of the peripheral stats. Like, just they don't happen very often for him. So I'm kind of a pass for me, but he is the guy that is kind of been their offense. The guy that I really do like, though, and he's done better in conference play, is Tyler Wall. In the two conference games, he's put up 37 and 35 fantasy points. He does put up peripheral stats, and he has been scoring the basketball as well. So Tyler Wall is a guy that I would definitely be considering on this Wisconsin side. That would probably be pretty much it. Steven Crowell at the center position is pretty solid for them, but Ohio State's pretty good at defending centers. One guy I do want to mention, though, Connor Essegian, in my opinion, was probably their best offensive player on their team last year, and he really hasn't found his footing yet this year, but he did play 12 minutes against Nebraska. He did get 9 shots off in those 12 minutes, and he did put up 15 fantasy points, and we would take that at a salary of $3,400. So Connor Essegian is a guy that I think I will be monitoring as the season goes on. I've gone over on this podcast before. I am a 20 max player when it comes to college basketball at DFS. I might have him in one of my 20 lineups just in case, but he's nothing more than like a GPP dart throw. Now, on the Ohio State side, Roddy Gale Jr. and Bruce Thornton are their two guys. They're their two high usage guards. They're both really solid college basketball players. I never get them right. One of them always seems to go off, and I never know which one it's going to be until they've already gone off. If anybody on this team is going to go off, it's going to be one of them two. Good luck figuring out which one. If I had to guess for this game, I would guess Roddy Gale because I think he's going to draw a weaker defensive matchup. But I'm not going to sit here and guarantee that. I'm not going to sit here and act like that's a sure thing. I'm just telling you, if one of the Ohio State guys goes off, it's going to be one of them too. Now, Jamison Battle is kind of the third wheel. He's got a very unique role on this team where he pretty much exclusively takes three-pointers. But he takes a lot of them. He makes a lot of them, and he gets a lot of boards. So, he's a really unique player in terms of his pathway to fantasy scoring. But if you get a good shooting night, you get a lot of minutes out of him, you get a lot of boards, he's a guy that could very easily hit value. I think he's a very solid cash game play more so than a tournament play because I think that his path is pretty narrow and, he's not going to get a whole lot of assists and steals. He's not going to drop 30 real points either. So he's not a guy I would consider for tournaments, but definitely a guy I would consider for cash. And then at the center position, I do have to mention you have seen more minutes in conference play for Felix Opara than you have for Zed Key. However, Zed Key, when he's out there, continues to be a high usage, really solid point per minute player. But Felix Opara is the one who is playing more minutes right now, and that is definitely a situation to monitor because if one of these guys can ever significantly outpace the other, that's a very lucrative fantasy position playing center for these Ohio State Buckeyes. All right, that does it for the last 4 games, and that does it for this episode for Wednesday, January 10th. If you like what you saw on YouTube or like what you heard on audio, please like the video on YouTube. I promise it really does help me out a lot. It does not fall on deaf ears. It helps the video get noticed. It helps the community grow, and I really do appreciate it. As well as on the audio feed, please rate and review the podcast. Again, I didn't know how much that stuff mattered until I started creating content, and it really does help, and I really do appreciate it. Lastly, there is some places where you can find me. Like we talked about, you can find me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. Join the Fantasy Corner Discord if you want to chop it up in there and talk about all the best plays and strategy. And also, there are my articles on the Patreon. It's late at night, y'all. Head to patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks if you want to get access to those articles. Now, that does it for the Wednesday, January 10th episode. I hope to be back for Thursday's episode. Reminder, we are not just a college basketball channel here. Now, if you hit that subscribe button to the audio feed as well as to the YouTube channel, we're closing on 400, y'all. If you subscribe to the YouTube channel as well as the audio feed, you'll get notified when all of our new episodes drop, like our weekly NFL and golf content as well as our college basketball content. So I'm hoping to do a few more college basketball episodes this week. Hopefully DraftKings will cooperate with me, give us some good slates that I can get on here and talk about. But I will also have weekly golf and NFL content, as well as I'm doing a golf one and done league. Check the channel for that video and all the golf stuff if you are interested in that. All right, that does it for this episode. So hopefully I was able to get you guys a lot of information, a lot of good information that's going to help you build some winning lineups for the Wednesday slate. If you have made it this far, best of luck to you tomorrow night. Come back for our next college basketball episode. Hit that subscribe button so you can get it. And then best of luck to you. Thank you guys for watching and listening, and I will see you next time.